I would please like you all to assemble for our next session on strengthening federalism. Thank you. So, welcome back to the third session of the day. I hope you all had a great lunch. So, this session will be on strengthening federalism. Now, this session is being moderated by Professor V.N. Alok, who's from Indian Institute of Public Administration. He is also a member of the Delhi State Finance Commission and has written extensively on India's fiscal federal architecture, and has also previously worked in international organizations such as World Bank and Forum Federations. He developed the concept of devolution index and also advised governments of Brazil, Sudan, and Nepal previously. So now I would like him to take over.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So this is the third session on strengthening federalisms in the India Economic Forum that is being organized by CII and the SKOCH Group. In this session, we will discuss how to strengthen the federal finance or the fiscal federalisms. Now the subject is a little technical, and I'm just going to give you a perspective, very simple perspective, not a very technical perspective of the federal aspects of governance, what we really mean by federalism, and how it is relevant, and what are the basis of the contemporary challenges. These are the things that we are going to discuss here in this session. Before I introduce the panelists, a very eminent panelist here, let me just say a few words about federalism. The federalism is a method of dividing powers so that the general and the regional governments are each within a sphere, remain independent, and at the same time they cooperate. So both autonomy and cooperations are inbuilt in the definition of federalisms. And if we emphasize the word cooperations, we sometimes use the word cooperative federalisms, whereby both the union and the states, or the federal government or the state government, they cooperate with each other. If it's a multi-order federalism, then all three orders of government, they cooperate with each other. So federalisms, or the federal form of government is quite important, and all big countries are federal. Whether you take US, you take Brazil, you take Argentina, Canada, except China. But the constitution is not federal, but the functioning of China is very federal in nature. There are two processes by which the federal governments or the federalisms devolves. One is that you are coming together, like US, the many federating units came together and you form a federations. The other, which is the case here in India, that you are devolving the powers. India was one country, and you devolve the powers, created many subnational governments. So certainly, when the processes are very different, whereby many federating units coming together and forming a federations, the power of the states are there. The power of the states are more, or the powers of the regional governments are more than the powers of the federal government. Whereas if you devolve the powers from the top, then certainly the powers of the central government or the federal government or the union government is little higher than the subnational governments. This particular form of governments have been adopted in big countries, and this has been adopted in some of the small countries. This has also been found as solutions, treated as a solution in a post-conflict environment such as Bosnia, Sudan, Nepal, and even Sri Lanka. So most countries are federal in nature, and this concept actually it evolves over a period of time because the systems are not the same. So India has made about 100 odd constitutional amendments. US made 27 constitutional amendments. Brazil has changed their constitution 7 times. So it evolves. And it also a functional concept, not really an institutional concept. So whether your constitution is federal, if it is not working, this may not be federal. The examples are, there are various examples, including the example of South Africa, whereby the scholars generally speak outside South Africa, that South Africa is the federal countries, but they are not allowed to speak that South Africa is the federal countries. And there are many non-negotiables under the federal polities. You have to have a written constitutions, and the constitution has to be very, very rigid, so that if you need to change the constitution, you have to have at least 2/3 majorities. There should be at least 2 orders of government, and both have the power to legislate. There could be 3 orders of government, but at least there should be 2 orders of government. And in case any kind of conflict arises, there should be some courts to interpret the provision of the constitutions. There are 4 pillars of fiscal federalism. First is the assignments of responsibilities. Various orders of government need to be assigned certain responsibilities. And there is some order internationally. Some literature has been written on this. The prominent among them is by Richard Musgrave, the father of the modern public finance. When you assign the responsibilities, you also assign the concomitant revenue handles. Generally, there is a mismatch between the responsibility assignment and the revenue assignment. So there would be intergovernmental, that is the third pillar. So you need to transfer resources. Generally, the resources are transferred from the top to the bottom. There were cases when the resources were transferred from the local government upwards. The case there was the Yugoslavia and USSR, and many experts say that led to their disintegrations. So when you transfer resources, you also need certain institutions. There's some impartial institutions, and they can decide that how much money need to be vertically transferred and which state or which regional government should get what. So the examples there are like in Australia, whereby they created a Commonwealth Grant Commissions, because one of some national unit that is, they threatened to secede. So it's about 100 years ago, they created the Commonwealth Grant Commissions. On that lines, India created the Finance Commissions. Similarly, there are cases in South Africa whereby you have a Fiscal and Financial Commissions. So you have a revenue assignment, you also have expenditure assignments and intergovernmental transfers, and then the institutions. Now come to the case here in India. Article 1 of the Constitution says that India, that is Bharat, shall be the union of states. The Constitution does not say that India is a federation of states. It only says a union of states. Because if you adopt a federal form of government in the constitutions, this is what Ambedkar thought of, then there will be a provision of secessions. But in Indian constitutions, only coming in, you cannot go out. I'll just take a minute. So it's a union of states. But there are a number of features by which we can say that India is a federal constitution. First, that there are two orders of government, and both have the powers to legislate. There are institutions which transfer resources, for example, the institution of finance commissions. And between the states and the local government, we have institutions like the state finance commissions. So in India, the Federal Assembly, it comprises the union government, 28 states, because now the Jammu and Kashmir has been made union territories with legislature. So there are now 28 states. 10 of them are considered special category states or a hilly or northeastern states. They get special fiscal dispensations from the union governments as well as institutions like finance commissions. There are 9 union territories. 3 of them are with legislatures, and rest of them are other union territories. Down the line, after the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment, we had Panchayati Raj institutions or panchayats. They are again at the 3 rungs. You have district panchayat, block panchayat, and the village panchayat. So about 250,000 odd panchayats and 4 million elected representatives. So we have so many governments in this country. There in the urban areas, we have municipalities. There are 3 levels: municipal corporations, municipalities, and nagar panchayats. The definition of these bodies are not there in the constitution, but these are there in the conformity acts. So each states define what municipal corporations, what municipalities, and what nagar panchayats are. So generally, in India, the union government collects more taxes, they spend less. About 60% of the taxes are being collected by the union government, and they spend about 40%. The reverse is the case there in the states. The states collect about 40% and spend 60% of the total public expenditures. So there is a need of vertical transfers. So the finance commissions is one institution. There are other institutions. The planning commission was there in place. It has been substituted by Niti Aayog without any kind of financial powers. Then there are institutions including the interstate councils. The National Development Council was there in place, which has been substituted with the Team India. Between the state and the local government, we have institutions like the state finance commissions, okay, to transfer resources from the state consolidated fund to the panchayat and municipalities. In order to discuss the nitty-gritty of this, we have a very, very eminent panelist have with us. I don't think there could be more eminent panelists than we have here with us. We have Mr. N.K. Singh himself, he's here. He's chairman of the 15 Finance Commissions, and who is just, will be submitting his interim report very, very soon. So he's here with us, and he was the chairman of the FRBM Review Committee, of which the RBI Governor and the Chief Economic Advisor and the Director NIPFP, Mr. Ratin Roy, is not here at the moment. He was also a member. They submitted, they proposed a kind of a path, the fiscal reforms path to the Government of India. And Stan K. Singh, he wears many caps, whether we call it, whether he's an economist or a politician or a civil servant. He started his career as a teacher in St. Stephen's College, teaching economics. And he actually learned economics from his childhood. His father was the first finance secretary of India. And he was a civil servant, a member of a very, very distinguished Indian administrative service, joined the service in 1964. And he retired from the Ministry of Finance as the secretary expenditure or secretary revenue. Then he moved to the Prime Minister's office as OSD, and later on he became the member of the planning commissions. He was also a member of parliament, so he wears many caps. In one words, I can say that he's a senior statesman. And before I introduce the other panelist, I would like to request Dr. N.K. Singh.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you on some issues of fiscal federalism, which is the subject of today's panel discussion. I'm somewhat hesitant to do so because only 4 days ago, I spoke rather extensively on this very subject at the L.K. Jha Memorial Lecture organized by the Reserve Bank of India, when I dealt with some of the suggestions of how to strengthen the fiscal architecture of this country. Now, I think Alok was not too wrong when he said that the fiscal architecture of the country has worked reasonably well in terms of what the constitutional provisions have been, and that those issues which constitute the deficits, the gaps in terms of resource equalization with responsibilities and the symmetrical action is by mechanisms which the Constitution itself has defined. Now, I think that since we are familiar with that territory, I'm going to make just 4 brief observations. First and foremost is that the Constitution, as we all know, has divided, broadly speaking, the governance architecture into 3 categories, which is outlined in the 7th schedule of the Constitution. I want to dwell a bit on this. The 7th schedule of the Constitution, as we all know, has 3 lists. A list 1, which deals with the responsibilities of the union government. A list 2, which are the responsibilities of the state government. And a list 3, which deals with the concurrent list of subjects, which are the responsibilities of both the union and the states, except that in the event of any conflict, the legislation passed by the union government shall take precedence over any legislation passed by any of the state governments. What has the history of our fiscal federalism so far demonstrated? It has so far demonstrated, in my view, that these lists, which were drawn up at the time of the Constitution, have to some extent proved malleable and have proved somewhat impractical. It has proved impractical right from the beginning because from the inception of the Planning Commission, many subjects which are in the domain of states were taken up by way of the use of Article 282 of the Constitution in the category of centrally sponsored schemes. These are some iconic ones like Gromo Food Program, the Bhakra Nangal Dam, and so on and so forth. But progressively, over a period of time, there is a marked incongruity in the Article 282 of the Constitution and the 7th schedule of the Constitution. Now, what is this Article 282 of the Constitution? The Article 282 is not a core provision of the Constitution. It is a residuary miscellaneous provision which says that notwithstanding any of the demarcation in any of the lists which have been given, the central government or the state government may choose to give a grant for any particular initiative or activity which is in the overall interest of the development of the state. Now, it is this Article 282 of the Constitution under which the Planning Commission, which has since been abolished, has so far created a whole plethora of centrally sponsored schemes. Now, what are these centrally sponsored schemes? The centrally sponsored schemes cover subjects which are well into the the list 2 of the state governments. They cover wide range of activities. They cover subjects which should be in the domain of the states, except that the fact that this original sin was not started recently. This original sin was started in the first 5-year plan itself, and since then, this sin has got increasingly more and more accentuated. And fiscal romantics, who feel deeply committed to the fact that these are subjects in the domain of states, should have spoken up when any time any of the centrally sponsored schemes related to issues which are purely in the domain of the states. So what has happened over time is there have been 3 other connected phenomena. First and foremost, that Parliament has over a period of time enacted standalone legislations, or what I call entitlement-driven legislations, which gives Parliament and gives a legislation the backing of an act enacted over and above what may be the demarcation of subjects in the 7th schedule of the Constitution. What are these? Right to work, the Manrega one, right to food, right to employment, and these are stand-alone legislations, even though prima facie employment, food security, and education are subjects which are purely in the domain of the states. These stand-alone legislations and how they legally mesh with the original architecture of the Constitution is an area where I think that the last word is yet to be said. Along with this, the second development was, as we know, the increased enlargement of the list of subjects in list 3, namely the concurrent list of the 7th schedule, in which many subjects which are in the state list got transferred to the subject of the concurrent list from the state list, like for instance, family planning, the issues of environment, issues of ecology, are subjects which got transferred from the state list to the concurrent list. All this has been happening over a period of time. What is the outcome today? The outcome today is that if you look at the drawing board, you'll find it a very cluttered drawing board. You'll find as many as perhaps 115 centrally sponsored schemes, notwithstanding many rationalization attempts which were made, the last one being under the committee headed by Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who headed a committee on rationalization of centrally sponsored schemes, in which they had 3 categories. You had the core of the core, and the optional. Now, these are nice, but under each of these, the centrally sponsored schemes have continued to dominate the scene. So much so that as far as the union government is concerned, every year the union government spends 3.53 lakh crores on these centrally sponsored schemes, an equivalent amount perhaps by the states. So the total amount which may be spent on centrally sponsored schemes, since it's not a 50-50 sharing ratio, I cannot just multiply by the double, but somewhere in the region of about 6 to 6.5 lakh crores per annum is spent on these centrally sponsored schemes between the union government and the state governments. Now, if you look at the subjects which are in the centrally sponsored schemes, they are largely subjects which were originally and predominantly in the domain of the states. Therefore, any model on fiscal architecture must reckon the fact that it is now a cluttered drawing board. We need to revisit this drawing board in a holistic way. And in fact, I'm not saying this just because the thought has just struck me. I was reading through the literature of this. A very eminent economist, Raja Mannar, who was also connected in the Finance Commission as the chairman of the Finance Commission, Raja Mannar had headed a committee way back in 1971 when he said that an eminent group should be constituted consisting of jurists, economists, and those engaged in policy making to revisit List 1, List 2, and List 3. I subscribe to that view. So my first big broad suggestion is that the seventh schedule of the Constitution, as originally defined, has ceased to serve the purpose which was intended. Because over a period of time, this has become malleable and become increasingly unrecognizable. It is time that we understand this contemporary reality. And by the way, do you think it is practical that if the Prime Minister of India were to visit Haryana, which is a next door state, and he happens to visit a Haryana district, and he wants to do something on drinking water or on power or on health, he'll be reminded that you can't do so because this is a subject which is in list 2 and is in the domain of the states. So I think technology, migration, and pressures which have taken place have wiped out the significance of a neat classification of subjects between list 1, list 2, and list 3. And the sooner we come to terms with this altered reality, the better would and more realistic would be the fiscal architecture which you want to have for the growth of the country. My second broad suggestion is that successive attempts to rationalize the centrally sponsored schemes have met with limited success. Because of the fact that more and more seem to get added, less and less seems to go away from the drawing board. We need to revisit the core centrally sponsored schemes on 8 or 9 clearly nationally defined priorities, have patterns of funding which are predictable and which are certain. State governments often have complained to me that a centrally sponsored scheme may begin with a sharing ratio of 75 by the central government, 25 by the states, but over a period of time, this gets dramatically altered. And once they are in a centrally sponsored schemes, it is very difficult for them to get out of these schemes because they have got used to it. There's a whole lot of establishment and bureaucratic structure which gets really embedded in this, true of the union government, true of the state government. So I think my second suggestion would be to have a holistic visit of all these centrally sponsored schemes, to see it also in the context of central outlay schemes. Many chief ministers have suggested to us that the central outlays, which are purely centrally funded, and the bulk of the central outlays, fortunately, happen to be in the areas of defense, happen to be in the area of internal security, happen to be in the area of railways, which are core subjects in list 1 of the central government. But I think we need to see the symmetry between central outlays and centrally sponsored schemes to improve the multiplier effects and optimize the multiplier gains. My fourth and last suggestion is that since the GST was a far-reaching, iconic reform of Part 12 of the Constitution relating to the sharing of the resources, which are both in the center and the states, the GST is indeed a very radical tax reform, and indeed the government of Narendra Modi under his leadership, under the huge amount of impetus which it got with the negotiating capability of late Mr. Jaitley and carried forward by the present finance minister, did achieve the virtual impossible, that what countries took decades to have a GST, India did it in a record time. Of course, it is nobody's case that this is the perfect GST, but this is a very robust beginning, which really augurs well in terms of India having one common market with one common taxation on goods and services. But I think that clearly there are attempts which are underway, and I would encourage these attempts of how to improve the compliance, on the cost of compliance, on the onerousness of compliance, on the predictability at which rates are determined, and in the manner in which the GST is being administered for the benefit of all stakeholders, which will really therefore enable the original objectives of the GST to be fully realized. But when I say this, let it not be misunderstood. When many critics have said that the GST is a failure, it's certainly not a failure. It is, in my view, an outstanding attempt to bring about a radical change in the architecture of taxation, which is going to have and which will have many multiplier gains in terms of having the simplicity of the tax structure. But having praised the GST, it does not mean really that it is not time for us to look at the kind of improvements on the kind of areas on which I have briefly touched upon. But to the extent that the Part 12 of the Constitution has been radically changed in terms of the taxation structure by the constitutional amendment which led to the GST, should not put us in a complacency that there is need for constant improvement and for constant refinement as we go along. My last point really, and I'll be very quick on this one, is something that Alok touched upon, the institutional changes which are necessary to be able to have a consultative mechanism between the center and the states. What should be an ideal consultative mechanism? Now, I think that we have, of course, the National Development Council, we have the Council on Center-State Relations, we have the Niti Aayog, and occasionally every 5 years, you have the Finance Commission. We need to see how each of these institutions become more robust to impart greater dynamism in a consultative mechanism between the center and the states. Let me conclude by saying that the fiscal architecture of India has withstood the test of time over the last 70, 72 years. This architecture has only got strengthened, but like in most countries, fiscal federalism is not a dead concept written in stone and not subject to changes. I think we need to be mindful of the fact that given the fact that technology, migration, increasing interdependence, not merely of India becoming a part of a global value-added chain, but of becoming an India value-added chain, which involves interdependent states, we need to revisit some of these subjects with a fresh mind. Thank you very much.
I know, thank you very much, sir, for excellent exposition. I know you were here till 3 o'clock. Okay, so I now move to the other panelist here, very eminent. I'll move to Dr. Sudipto Mandal, who was the member of the 14 Finance Commissions. And the recommendations of the 14 Finance Commissions are there in place. Before I request Dr. Mandal to make his opening remarks, a minute or two on him. He's now with the National Council of Applied Economic Research, and he has been with the Asian Development Bank and professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. He has been writing extensively on various aspects, macroeconomics, state subject particularly that's very close to his heart, and various other subjects. So thank you, sir, that you're here with us. Before, sir, you make your opening remark, I just have a question to you. The 14 Finance Commissions made certain path-breaking recommendations. And this government, which is there in place, headed by Narendra Modi, they accepted the recommendations. There could have been a case that the Finance Commission is only a recommendatory body under Article 280 of the Constitutions, and under Article 281, it is for the Parliament to decide whether to accept it or not to accept it. So they accepted the recommendations, and that is there in place. Then what made this government to frame such kind of terms of reference for the 15 Finance Commissions, which is not really a verbatim reproductions of Article 280, but of a number of other areas. So I will not request Mr. N.K. Singh to say on this. I know he has limitations. But the central government could have submitted a memorandum instead of making a micromanagement and asking the 15 Finance Commissions to get into this. So This you may like to include, or otherwise you make your opening remarks on this. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anup. Distinguished members of the panel and on the board, on the podium, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much, SKOCH, for inviting me to be a panelist today. I should mention that when I was an undergraduate student here in St. Stephen's College, we used to hear about a person who had been a legendary debater, and that was none other than Mr. N.K. Singh, who had already passed out a few years before I got there. So to be on a panel with him and to speak immediately after him, I must say, is quite a daunting challenge. Fortunately, I think on most things, he has made a brilliant presentation, I thought, and I happen to be on the same page as him. So it is not that daunting after all. Let me now come to the subject hand, and perhaps in some way it will address the question Anup you raised. There is a context in which, again, this question of the architecture of fiscal federalism in this country has got a lot of attention, and there have been a few key developments which impinge on this architecture. The first one, of course, is the introduction of the goods and services tax, and which is now supervised and monitored and implemented by the GST Council, which brings about a whole different quality of relationship, because that council is headed by the finance minister, but its members are all the finance ministers of different states. It's made a very big change. Second development was, of course, the abolition of the Planning Commission and eventually even the removal of the distinction between planned and non-planned finance. This is a subject on which Mr. Singh did speak at some length. But again, this affected the structure of our fiscal federal relationship, because as you will recall, the Planning Commission was at its apex. There was the National Development Council headed by the Prime Minister, which in that old form does not exist anymore. Third, there was the award of the 14th Finance Commission, which Anup was referring to. Since I was a member, I should take a few minutes to explain what it done. There is a certain amount of revenues, what is known as the shareable pool, which is shared between the center and the states. This does not include some items of revenue like cesses and surcharges, but all taxes are included there. Now, progressively from one finance commission to the next, the share of what goes to the states has been incrementally going up. Under the 13th Finance Commission, it had been raised to 32% of the shareable pool. The 14th Finance Commission very substantially raised this to 42%. But I should also emphasize that while the total of the shareable pool that was devolved was raised to 42%, the share of the shareable pool itself was actually not raised at all by the 14th Finance Commission. In fact, at that time, it had been about 61 or 62% during the period of the 13th Finance Commission, and during the 14th Finance Commission, it became something like 63% of the total shareable pool. But as I said, the devolved part, the devolution part, was raised from 32 to 42%. That was a big change. There was a lot of misunderstanding that as if the total amount of the shareable pool that was being given to the states was being raised. Actually, what was raised was just the untied part, the devolution part, because that is just given as a share of taxes to the states, and they do what they want with it. But while not raising the total fiscal space of the states, it certainly raised their autonomy, their power to decide what to do with that fiscal space, and in that sense it was indeed a significant change. The next big development, and this is again something Anup referred to, were the terms of reference of the 14th Finance Commission, including the amendments, 2 amendments that have come subsequently. Rightly or wrongly, a number of states felt that this was the beginning of an intrusion to reduce the autonomy of the states. And I must emphasize here that Mr. Modi, then as Chief Minister of Gujarat, had been one of the leading proponents of increasing the powers of the states in federal fiscal relations, as in fact is mentioned in SKOCH's sort of background document. Whether his view on this has changed in his new vantage position as Prime Minister or not, I do not know. It can happen because you see things from a different perspective. So that was there, and some of these states felt that their fiscal space was going to be eroded. Some states got together and formed, not an association, but they had some seminars and so forth. So that has also created some concern, and also the amendments that followed. So this is the context in which we are today again talking about federal fiscal relations. Let me start by making a first of all, in passing, I don't know whether I'll have time to come back to it, that when we talk about federal fiscal relations, there are actually 2 parts to it. There's a relation between the center and the states, which gets most of the attention, but there's also the relationship between the state governments and the third tier of government, namely the Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies. And this very often is largely neglected. If I have time, I'll come back to it, but let me put that aside for the moment and talk mainly about the relation with center and states. Now, what that amendment suggested, the first amendment, was to carve out something from the devolution share for defense and security purposes. And it was seen as this was taking away fiscal space of the states. Now, while defense is a national subject indeed in terms of the distribution of subjects in Schedule 7 that Mr. Singh was referring to, internal security is certainly partly a responsibility of the states. And in that sense, a part of what is their fiscal space has always been and continues to be devoted to internal security. Now, so if a part of this is replaced by the center taking that over, maybe the fiscal space is not reduced, only the autonomy is being reduced in the sense that now the center decides how, say, the state police and so on are to be assigned as part of their tasks are to be assigned as a central decision rather than that of the states. But their fiscal space, which was being used earlier for this purpose, will still be used for that purpose. And that's just a little clarification I wanted to make. And it's important to make this point because, this, in a sense, the same thing applies to the centrally sponsored schemes to which Mr. Singh referred at great length and described extremely well what this does. Since these are tied, shared responsibilities, the center gives some money, the states give the rest. So being part of that means it also ties up a part of the fiscal space of the states for programs which are actually decided by the center, and there's a huge proliferation of them. They are, in fact, a major source of fiscal transfers apart from Finance Commission awards, and this has become a very contentious issue. So with these thoughts in the background, there are different options of how to restructure federal fiscal relations which have been talked about, and I will quickly go over them. The first one, and which is something that a number of states have been saying for quite some time, and that has to do with the fact that, look, whatever it is that you decide to give us, whether it is 40% or 50% or 62% as is the case, give us the whole amount as a devolution, and then let us decide what we will do with it. You don't tell us how much of it is to be used for some other purposes. Now, I think this is an unrealistic demand of the states for the simple reason that there are a number of things that the states deal with which have spillover effects beyond the borders of the state. Whether it is you talk about health or even education and so on, a number of these things, certainly environment protection issues, pollution issues. So therefore, they cannot just be left to the states, and they have to be also addressed by the center. A second aspect, which is often forgotten, is that while the states may be demanding that it be left to them to design their own schemes and policies and so forth, and they just be given a total amount as untied amount, this may be fine for the more advanced, better off, high capability states, because they can indeed design their own programs and so on. But there are weaker states. I don't want to identify them, but you know that there are a lot of these states which are sort of lower down in the ordering of the advancement of states and their capabilities, who are actually not in a position always to design these programs. Then they often say that it helps us if there's a centrally sponsored scheme under which there's a central design which comes to us. So there are two sides of that argument. Second option, which has also been proposed, is that even though the Planning Commission was abolished, there are certain tasks of planning which remain. And therefore, we now have a missing institution. And different suggestions have been made of how this can be changed. One suggestion is that I don't know what Mr. Singh will think about this, but one suggestion is that the Finance Commission be made into a permanent body, which was never made, even though it's a constitutional body, and a body which is not actually a constitutional body, like the Planning Commission was a permanent body. So that was an anomaly which has now been partially corrected. You can go a step further, make the Finance Commission a permanent body, and since there are no distinctions now between plan and non-plan subjects, and the Finance Commission looks after the total finances and allocation, it can also look beyond short-term allocations to long-term allocation for planning purposes. So that would be another way to go about it. But this would mean actually a further erosion of the autonomy of the states, because right now what is being decided with the states would then be decided by the Finance Commission. And while the Finance Commission is not a body of the central government, it is a federal body which is, as it were, a referee between the center and the states. It is nevertheless a decision which is not the states. So this would be a decision-making power which would move away from the states, so it would obviously not be very popular with them. But there's a third option, and that is my preferred option, which is to empower a body that already exists, that is the Interstates Council. Now, this is a constitutional body that exists. Unfortunately, it has never been used properly. It is parked inside the Home Ministry, which is very peculiar for a Home Ministry central government, which is a very peculiar thing to do for what is supposed to be a federal body. But that can be reinvented, can be restructured as a genuinely powerful body, more or less modeled along the lines of the GST Council, except that in this case, the chair would be the Prime Minister, not the Finance Minister, and you would have the Chief Ministers as its members. And they would be making decisions on things like programs that are currently being supported by these centrally sponsored schemes and so on, which Mr. Singh talked about at great length. And given the experience that we've had with the GST Council, it is certainly the most effective federal institution of cooperative federalism that we've had so far. I think that's a good model to think about. And let me say in passing, and in fact endorse what Mr. Singh already said, that the GST, the way it has been rolled out, is one of the main reasons why there's a huge shortfall in revenues today, and that is causing a lot of stress in our macroeconomic management, and partly responsible for the decline in growth rates and so forth, which I'm not going into now. But it is important to recognize that it is only because it was rolled out without proper preparation, impact of the GSTN and so on, which are the core of it. But this should not be taken as implying that the tax itself is something that is not good. In fact, it's an excellent tax, and I hope we will quickly get our act together to reform the way that tax is being administered. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mandal, for raising a number of issues. You just heard the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. You just heard the member of the 14 Finance Commissions. The Finance Commission redistribute the income and transfer resources to the poor state, take from rich. So in other words, Finance Commission is a modern Robin Hood. Okay. Before I request Dr. Pooja Mehra, I can take one or two questions here from the participants. If you have anything to ask, not to make longish comments. Otherwise, I can request Dr. Pooja Mehra. She has been introduced in the first session. She was moderating there. She has been writing very extensively in newspapers. She has been awarded for her journalism in economics and finances. And you can take up the suggestions made by Professor Sudipto Mandal that can this Niti Aayog too can assume the role of the earlier finance planning commissions. And so can that be?
Thank you very much. Am I audible? I think the point has been made by Professor Mandal, before him, Mr. Singh, and many other experts before, that whereas the Planning Commission was, for long, it was said that it had not kept in tune with the needs of the economy, and after 1991, it was struggling to define a role for itself. But at the same time, the abolition of the Planning Commission and its replacement by the Niti Aayog has sort of created a vacuum in terms of the states not having any platform for dialogue with the center in terms of their annual plans, in terms of negotiating for funds and bargaining for schemes to eliminate or reduce regional imbalances, because the finance ministry is not very equipped to perform that sort of a role. The finance ministry's primary focus at all points in time is revenue collection and fiscal deficit, and that by its very nature kind of conflicts with states wanting more funds or funds in a certain way for spending, for development expenditure, etc. So I absolutely agree that after the Planning Commission was abolished, there is a vacuum, and the states need some sort of platform in the center to talk about these things to the center. The more immediate issue, I think, in fiscal federalism that we are facing already and will face is on the GST. Already collections are falling short of the 14% growth year on year that was, I think, promised, projected. And states are wanting an extension of the assured compensation from the center for shortfalls in what they projected as collections. And in fact, some of the compensation that has to be paid to them, state finance ministers have come to Delhi last week and complained that those are pending. They are not getting their dues. Now, why has GST turned out to be the way it has? I think the political economy of it is responsible over here. The mechanism of the GST Council, which is the main institution that that is common platform on which the center and the states talk to each other on these issues, comprises of state finance ministers, and state finance ministers stand to lose bulk of their clout. Now, this is a political economy issue. They stand to lose bulk of their clout if the GST becomes very smooth, because that would mean no discretion for state finance ministers. That would mean nobody would come to them and lobby for changes in tax cuts, removal or addition to exemption lists. And state finance ministers' job would not be as high profile as it is right now. So I think what is happening is that at the GST Council, there are these bunch of politicians, all of who want, whether they realize it or not, but if they have to perpetuate their clout, they have to perpetuate discretion, and they have to perpetuate complications, and that's not what the rest of the economy wants. So perhaps it is time for us to begin to question if we need a different institutional setup in place of the GST Council, and also how prudent it is to keep revisiting the tax structure, the compliance structure, and if less political inputs and more of technical inputs begin to go into these decisions. Finally, I wanted to make a small point on the uses of cesses by the central government, which is another sticking point between the center and the states. All the cesses that the center collects, they don't share that money with the states. They get to keep all of it. And I think at the last calculation, the center's collecting almost 14% of its gross taxes as cesses, which I think is very unfair to states. And that is probably another point that needs to be discussed.
Thank you, Renu. You want to say something on the Planning Commission? Professor Renu Kohli, professor at the National Council of Applied Economic Research. So over this issue of the Niti Aayog too, which can assume the role of planning commissions.
I would say I'm no longer with NCAR, first of all, to start with. I'm independent now, currently. Yes, I think I endorse and agree with Mr. Mandal and with Pooja about the need for a platform for extensive, more, greater camaraderie and more franker and longer discussions with the states. I also want to flag a couple of things that Sudipto mentioned, which was, one was about the permanent demand for or a suggestion for a permanent finance commission. In my view, it would not be, as he also disagreed, and I would also strongly argue against such a permanent body. For a couple of reasons. One is that inherently by composition, design and structure, the Finance Commission is weighted and primarily decided by the center, A. And second is that reason that the states in any case have an inherently weak position to start with in terms of their dependency, or even though the process is very extensively consultative and their concerns are taken on board, but they have a resource, they have a financing constraint, which the center does not have, which is that the center can pretty much borrow and resort to deficit financing. It's not that the states can't, they can do so too, but they must take the permission of the center. Usually that permission is always given and it doesn't really, constrain the states, but the fact that it has to be, the permission has to be taken, is by itself a kind of a weakening premise. More than that, I think the most important point is between the center and states' fiscal relations and consultation is when the going is good, that means that if there is a cycle is on the upswing, the revenue position is buoyant, things are good, and therefore there's enough money to go around. But the problems arise and the strains arise on the downswing when the cycle is going down, and currently we are facing that, and it's a vicious spiral. It's a vicious spiral because revenues go down. On one hand, there is this, very optimistic promise of 14% nominal growth in GST revenues. Furthermore, both the center and the states are constrained by the fiscal rules, which is the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, and that binds that the general government debt to GDP ratio has to be brought down to 60% by 25. And on the other hand, the reduction in the case of the states has to come down to 20%. Currently, it's almost 25% of GDP. In the case of the center, it has to come to 40%, and currently it's around in the region of around 48% of GDP region. Now, what is happening is that the vicious spiral, growth goes down, revenues go down, and the center has a greater tug in terms of its commitment to the states, but then the states are bound too, because all these assumptions have been made on the basis of nominal GDP growth of 12% of GDP. And I was just looking at the numbers put out by the RBI in its report on state finances on debt sustainability. And already the RBI is projecting 11.5 average for the next year, the next 5 years. So the constraint is going to be very, very biting and binding for the states who have already been cutting down capital spending. How do you get out of this trap? The only way to me, it seems, is the FRBM itself ought to be amended, which means that coming back, both center and states coming back to the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kohli. Ladies and gentlemen, we do have an economist who has worked in the Reserve Bank of India, and I call him a banker. At present, he's with the Anderson School of Management at the University of California, where he visits quite often. So, Professor Singh, generally the poor and the rich states, they are in conflict with each other for the fiscal transfers of resources. Some says that it could be on equity considerations, the rich state says is on efficiency considerations. But you being a banker, the rich states generally get a very favorable treatment from the scheduled commercial bank. The poor states, the credit deposit ratio is very, very low because of the economic development, the pattern of economic development that they have. Is their economy is based on agriculture, small scale. So there is a capital flight that we have seen. So how do you really see this part of this?
First of all, I must thank Samir to invite me. I should just clarify that, yes, I did work in the Reserve Bank, but my colleague Renu Kohli also worked in the Reserve Bank. So we are both from the same banking fraternity that we are, and therefore we exchange thoughts and notes often. Now, before I come to the pointed question that you are asking, I would like to make a few points. Actually, I would like to make two major points for the Finance Commission. And then from there, I'll relate to the banking industry. If you look at the data, and this issue has not been touched at all in most of the cases. If you look at the data for the Finance Commission, and we are into the 15th Finance Commission, at the state level, the Finance Commissions have not been so regular. And if you look at the local bodies, the situation is extremely difficult. So therefore, I feel when there is a story of the Finance Commission, and as Professor Mandal was mentioning, that we need a permanent Finance Commission, I thought it was very pertinent to mention that though at the federal level, we are doing, and this is a session on fiscal federalism, though at the federal level we are so strong and we are doing so much onto the fiscal front, it's not replicated at the state levels and certainly not at the local bodies level. Now let me also bring to your notice, when you look at the local bodies, there is not even a consolidated local body data in our country, even for Karnataka, a state which is pretty advanced, and World Bank is helping them to put in a place, a data statistical place, where we would have a consolidated picture of the local finances. So I think that is one thing which I wanted, that we need to strengthen while we keep doing the intergovernmental transfers and we talk of the centrally sponsored schemes. Is it that after nearly 2.5 decades of the 73rd Amendment, our local bodies are still not strong and they're dependent on the transfers which come from the Finance Commission at the center. The second issue that I wanted to flag was basically the interest rate burden on some of the states. Now you'll be surprised to know that in states like Haryana and Punjab, nearly 20% of the revenue receipt or nearly 19% of the revenue expenditure goes on interest payments. Now, if this was the situation in the private corporate sector, they would have gone for debt restructuring. But here in the state finances, that's why I say, as for the center, the Finance Commission regularly looks into various issues. For the state governments, I think something needs to be done there. The last point that I want to make on the fiscal issue before I come to the banking sector, yes, the resources that are available at the local bodies are limited, and that's understood. I was thinking, like the state governments followed a joint family approach while borrowing, and my colleague here, Dr. Renu Kohli would know how in the Reserve Bank we used to follow the joint family approach for market borrowings. Maybe for local bodies, whosoever are willing, we should adopt the same strategy and help them borrow. Now coming to the pointed questions that you mentioned, as far as the banking is concerned, I would like to say that if you look at the highest deposits and the highest credit numbers in crore, you are right. The western region is at the top, and Maharashtra and Gujarat are the highest in deposits, very prosperous states, very rich states, followed by southern region, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, again as expected, followed by northern region, Haryana and Punjab, even Delhi. Delhi does much better than Punjab. When you look at the deposits, this is the picture. When you look at credit, because you spoke about the credit deposit ratio, when you look at credit, surprisingly, the western region again tops. So and again Gujarat and Maharashtra on the top. The southern region again is number 2, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Northern region is number 3, again Punjab and Haryana. To that extent, the credit deposit ratio gets evened out. Now when you look at the latest trend that is happening, look at the growth rates and compare the credit growth with the deposit growth, you'll be surprised that credit growth is higher because of the absorption capacity, the way industry comes up in northern, western and southern region. In the deposit over credit, deposit growth higher than the credit, where now the issue of the CD ratio not coming up to the expectation, or the term that you use, the flight of capital, is very true for northeast, eastern and central region. So to some areas, the hypothesis of yours is applicable, while in other areas, like the northern, western and southern, CD ratio almost balances out. I would like to conclude this opening remarks or the questions that you raised by saying, yes, obviously, states which do not have high absorption capacity are those states where the high per capita income is not there, and therefore they are not able to generate or create deposits equivalent to what their requirements are. And that is exactly the reason that then the government intervenes and brings in the issue of the priority sector lending. So there's more equitable distribution, at least of credit, if not growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good that you raised the questions of the local government, both panchayats and municipalities. These two institutions are actually mandated for the local service delivery. And you also raised the issues of strengthening the State Finance Commission. We'll come back to this. And before that, we can take one or two questions from the participants. If there are any questions, yes, there's a gentleman there. Can you give a mic, please?
Good afternoon, sir. So, taking off from what Charan Singh sir said, I wanted to ask Professor Mandal about the local bodies. There was an analysis done a couple of years back in an economic survey by Arvind Subramaniam, and he had said pertaining to urban local bodies, he had analyzed 14 states, and he said there's one aspect of the transfer from the state to the urban local bodies. But there's another aspect of urban local bodies having the capacity to collect taxes. And according to him, there was only there were about 14 states that he had analyzed. I still remember the number. He had said that they're collecting only 7 to 19% of the taxes which they can collect. So the tax collection capacity right now is also very less amongst the urban local bodies. So when it comes to fiscal federalism, there's one aspect from center to state, but won't it truly be fiscal federalism in your view when urban local bodies and panchayati raj bodies are empowered for revenue generation and expenditure at the local level?
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, so the question here is that there is a tendency of centralizations of revenue and decentralization of responsibilities. The institution down the line, that is municipalities and panchayat. Municipalities, we can exclude municipal corporations, so they can collect revenues, for example, Bombay Municipal Corporations or the NDMC, New Delhi Municipal Councils. But if you leave municipal corporation, the municipalities and Nagar Panchayat are as good as the Panchayati Raj institutions. So they collect very little revenues of their own. Sir, would say so?
Yeah, I'm very glad you on. Can you hear me? I'm very glad you raised this question because it gives me a chance to address something I wanted to say during my original talk, but I had run out of time. You know, there's an impression that after the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments, that the local governments like Panchayati Raj institutions on one side and urban local bodies on the other have been very substantially empowered. But the fact of the matter is that both those amendments actually left it to the state governments to decide how much should be really devolved in terms of empowerment to the local bodies. Now, the state governments are governments where legislation is done by the MLAs. And so it's a zero-sum game. The more you devolve to the local governments, the less is left for the MLAs. So in other words, the very people who would find it against their interest to devolve to the local governments were empowered to bring in the legislation would enable that empowerment. So there's a kind of contradiction in that amendment itself, and what you have seen, the complete failure of local government capacity to develop, which Mr. Singh was referring to, is really a product of that. And as a consequence, the state finance commissions are not taken very seriously. Some of them are not even appointed. This is a violation of the constitution, but this goes on and we have been living with this. As far as the capacity question is concerned, it's a chicken and egg. You don't invest in them, you don't allow capacity to develop, and that then becomes the judgment, oh, they don't have capacity, so we cannot devolve further. So you really have to crack the problem at the level of initially legislatively, constitutionally empowering them, and then you can take the other steps.
So you need to enable them first, the empowerment come later. That's the question, sir.
I also had in mind some of the local bodies like the Baroda Municipal Corporation, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, Mumbai Municipal Corporation, which are doing reasonably well. And at least such corporations, if one can conceive an umbrella body which can help them raise resources so that they're not constrained in their expenditure by the revenues that they are able to muster, whatever, or the transfers that happen to them from the state or the center. At least such local bodies which have some credibility and have done some borrowing in the past, they could be brought together. So that was the thought when I spoke about the joint family approach for borrowings by the local bodies, so that they can spend more, they're closer to the masses and their expenditure is more effective, easily evaluated and easily monitored.
Thank you. Any other questions this side? Okay. This municipal corporations, Professor Singh, is almost like a state government there in Bombay, and they had a very buoyant source of revenue. For example, octroi, that is there with them, and which has been now converted to a local body tax, and as controversial as octroi was. But the question was, Professor Mandal has said, is about these panchayats. They hardly collects any revenues of their own, hardly 5%, and depends upon the intergovernmental transfer systems. His commission, that is the 14th Finance Commission, allocated 2 lakhs crores over a period of 5 years, and said that interstate distributions for this money among all ranks of panchayat within the state has to be with the recommendations of the state finance commissions. But that did not really help to the state finance commission to come up. So how do we strengthen the state finance commissions? Because this institution is there for the last 25 years or so. The act of the State Finance Commission is not very similar to the act of the Union Finance Commissions. The constitutional provisions, that is Article 243I, it says that at the expiry of every 5th year, it didn't say the expiry of every 5th year or earlier, what is the case of the Union Finance Commission. So the state government, they can constitute a commission, or they may not constitute a commissions. And if the report is submitted, that is the case there in Maharashtra and Karnataka in the past, did not really see the light of the day. Okay. So my submissions, if you all agree, is as follows. On the line of the Commonwealth Grant Commissions, because there in Australia also you have the Commonwealth Grant Commission, very similar to the Finance Commissions, and at the state level, the State Grants Commissions. So Commonwealth Grant Commissions allocated certain percentage to the states, that if you constitute the State Grants Commission, then you will be eligible to get this kind of money. So that actually helped there in Australia to constitute the State Grants Commissions. I think the similar, I don't know, Professor N.K. Singh has just gone, the 15 Finance Commissions can suggest for the states that the State Finance Commissions come up with this. So this is about, any other questions or any comments to make at this point? Yes, the lady there.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for the enlightening session. Mr. N.K. Singh pointed out that there is a need to change how the state, center, and concurrent lists are constructed, considering things have changed. I wanted to ask if there are any creative suggestions among the panelists on how that change can happen so that the federalism, fiscal federalism could be strengthened. Any constructive or creative ideas around that? Another thing that I wanted to point out was we are a federal structure in terms of politics as well. So I just wanted to ask whether it's a problem in execution of some of the centrally sponsored scheme if the government at the center is different from the government at the state level, like different parties are ruling state and the center. Is there ever a problem, is there a big problem in execution of some of the centrally sponsored schemes? So those are the 2 questions.
So the relook at the 7th schedule, the union list, state list, and the concurrent list, whether there's a need, or how to restructure the need-blind, centrally sponsored schemes, right? That's a question. There's a gentleman there. You wanted to ask some questions? Yeah.
Sir, I have a question from Sudipto Mandal, sir. Sir, why 14th Finance Commission ignored to give fund to intermediate panchayats and district panchayat and directly give it to only gram panchayats? That's a simple question, sir.
That you can take or may not take. That's right. Okay, there's a question there, sir. The lady there.
Sir, I have a question from Sudipto Mandal, sir. Sir, why 14th Finance Commission ignored to give fund to intermediate panchayats and district panchayat and directly give it to only gram panchayats? That's a simple question, sir.
Okay, there's a question there, sir.
So, NK sir spoke at length about on CSS. My question is not on if we have to cut down on CSS. It's majorly how when center contributes to the matters which are on the subject list, do you reckon that states should also contribute to the subjects which are specific to the center, like let's say defense or security, internal security?
There should be separate fund for security? That's a question? Oh, a state should contribute. Okay. So, they just say, okay.
I take the question. On this, about suggestions for federal listing, Mr. Mandal actually gave 3 to 4 suggestions on how to, options for what are the options that have been suggested and what he would suggest, etc., on how to, balance federal relations. On the CSS issue, whether it's a problem in implementations, well, I would say yes and no. Many of these schemes actually require that the center are bound by the kind of a matching contribution, which is probably the ratio in 60 to 40 and so on. Now, the real issue is actually, which was touched upon by Mr. Singh and by Mr. Mandal also, that what is the constitutional position in terms of the list 1 and list 2 and list 3, which is, exclusive domain of the center, exclusive domain of the states. Now, as far as the center is concerned, and there was also an additional question on national security and defense, so I may also include my answer to that, which is whether states should contribute. No, it is the responsibility of the center, and the center's responsibilities are very, I would say it's a very bad idea. It's just an, underhand way of dipping into the state's share. So going back to the CSS. Now, the problem is like this. If you look, let's just take the period from 2011 to now. If you see, overall expenditure on education and health is about 4.5% of GDP, of which 4.1% comes from the states. Capital as well as revenue on expenditure on health and education. If you see the center's contributions or spending on in the education sector, it has actually halved from what it was in pre-2014 to now. It's barely down to 0.1% GDP. And the general increment that has taken place, the states have kept up. Ditto for the health sector. Now, many of these schemes are relating to, obviously, education, health, primary, etc. So, yes, I mean, I think there is an issue there. And the states should have the greater play because they also have a greater capacity and capability to spend.
Thank you. There was a questions about this relook at the 7th schedule. Who proposed this, who actually proposed this has gone. So I don't want others to respond on this. But there was a questions about the 14th Finance Commission, why they did not. So we will come back to this. There's going to be a nice tea break after this. There's no tea break, directly, no other questions. So thank you very much for the observations, and thank you very much for the suggestion that you made. I think you all agree with this, that the terms of reference or the period of the Finance Commission can be revisited. If you all agree with this, I think there could be one consensus from this House, right? The Finance Commission terms is 5 years. Now, you also have a GST Council there in place. So, the other commissions in the world, they generally permanent body or they are there for longish period. So, why this Finance Commission for 5 years or so, why can't be 10 years? This is what Dr. N.K. Singh just proposed there. So, Mr. Kochar wanted this, there has to be 1 or 2 consensus from these discussions. So if all agree, that's right. I do have another proposals, if you all agree. See, Finance Commission is a federal body, and it's a terms of reference and the membership are all decided by the union government. I met some friends there in Kerala and other places. They said there has to be a meeting of state finance ministers to decide the terms of reference and the membership. For example, the membership of the Commonwealth Grant Commission, the Fiscal Financial Commissions, there are some representations from the local government associations. So this particular job should not be left to the North Bloc. The whole consensus be there in place. So if you all agree with this. So thank you so very much for the participation. This was a very excellent session. A lot of suggestions has come. So thank you so very much. And thanks, Amit, for this. Thank you.
For the group photo.